Can you hear me? Alexander,
Yes.
good. So good morning, and let's get right into it. We're going to do the remaining review questions. And the first question I'm taking up is the question of briefly outline the steps toward the emergence of a strong French monarchy in the early modern period. So here we start with Charles VII. Remember, in the 15th century, chases out the English, and and sort of reconsolidates the French state on a new basis. He receives the right to collect taxes, the income tax, the tithe, the gabelle, the sales tax, without consulting. Without any consultation, the basis of the absolute monarchy, creates a standing army out of the nobility, sets up law courts, which are parliaments, called parliaments, and on this basis begins to unify France. And this process is more or less completed by the king in the first part of the 16th century, Francis I, who, of course, has all of these factors in his as a foundation, but also now reaches an agreement with the Pope in 1516, the Concordat of Bologna, which gives him control of the economic and political resources of the French church. On this basis, then, he's able to create a large army which fights wars with Spain for control of Italy, and he keeps increasing taxes, increasing the bureaucracy, growing the army, and he also creates this lavish court, 8,000 courtiers. Following his death, however, there's another reign, but that doesn't matter. There is a reaction against this growing absolutism in the form of the wars of religion, which lasts through the latter part of the 16th century. They're about religion, but they're also about landlord reaction, feudal reaction, and also the protests of the lower classes against excessive taxation. The wars are bloody and highly destructive, and you begin to get a reconstruction of the French state under Henry IV, who, remember, he said, Paris is worth a mass. He converts from Protestantism to Catholicism, and he passes the Edict of Nantes, which grants toleration to the Protestants, 1598. In addition to that, he is the one who invents French mercantilism, protection for local industries, subsidies for local industries, external tariffs, in order to rebuild the French economy. Following his all too brief reign, remember, assassination, succeeded by his son, Louis XIII, whose first minister is Richelieu. Richelieu, the man, the cardinal, who believed in Machiavelli's raison d'etat, reason of state. The state is everything, and what the state does to strengthen the power of the monarchy is inherently moral and positive. So he, on the basis of the achievements of the previous monarchs, and it's all cumulative, he begins to bring the nobles under control. He extends French mercantilism. He raises taxes. He creates the largest army that France had seen up to this point, some 20 or 25,000 infantry. And on this basis, and using alliances with other states, he's able to break the power of Spain. Recall that Spain was the greatest power. And so he ends the supremacy of France, and now it's of Spain, and now it's the turn of England. And so you have Louis XIV. Now, in terms of Louis XIV, of course, his claims of divine right to rule, but making that good, he sends the intendants or the intendants into the provinces, and these royal agents who have complete powers basically break the power of the nobles, of the local privileges of the towns. They institute absolute rule down in the provinces. The nobles, or the leading nobles, they lose their local power, and they're invited to join the king at the new Palace of Versailles, which becomes the focal point of not only the political and administrative system of France, but French cultural influence. It sets the tone of aristocratic culture, not only for France, but all of Europe. The French kings, of course, already controlled the church, but now Louis XIV, the church is simply the servant of the French state. And of course, that involves also for him getting rid of the Protestants. And so he cancels the the Edict of Toleration of 1685. With his economic minister Colbert, he vastly deepens mercantilism. There's a lot more protected manufacturing, and the buildup of French colonialism in Canada and India, in the Caribbean. And last but not least, the vast expansion of the French army and navy. That's the answer to that question. The following question, the following question is, by the way, do you have any comments about what I've said? Okay, onward. The next question is essentially the same, except that obviously we're not dealing with we're just dealing with the reign of Louis XIV here. So what I would do in answering is I would stress the fact that Louis XIV's reign, which was a very long reign, 1643 to 1715, is marked by an unending succession of wars. There's the Dutch War, the War of the League of Augsburg, and the War of the Spanish Succession. In the first, he tries to conquer Holland. In the second, he tries to extend the French frontier into Germany, to the Rhine River. And in the third war, he tries to take over Spain with its empire in Latin America. So there's this constant war, and so you want to talk about the fact that he, in order to carry on this war, he creates a huge army, 500,000 men, the largest navy in Europe. He builds up the French economy, and colonialism, but in order to strengthen the military. And of course, you might mention the Edict of Nantes, the control over the church, Versailles, the Intendant, and the control over the nobles. That might be appended to this answer. But then, of course, you want to say that despite everything, the English stood in the way. Above all, it was the English that stood in the way. And the English, Louis XIV had this idea of essentially subduing all of Europe, like Charles V. But the English frustrated him because with their growing economic power, the English using their money and creating a system of alliances, they offset and ultimately crushed the military effort of Louis XIV. So that's the answer to that question. The next question asks, it's more or less the same as the previous, so I'll move on. The next question, explain the context of the English Revolution and Civil War of the 17th century. So, of course, you start answering this question by noting that a war between the Parliament and the King broke out in 1642. And you basically say, well, why did that happen? Why was this conflict between the King and the Parliament? And so I think what we want, in answering this, you want to say, let's start with the reign of Charles I, 1625 to 42. His reign began inauspiciously. He called 3 parliaments, and no sooner did he call these parliaments, one after the other, between 1625 and 28, than the members of the parliament began to fight with the king over foreign policy. They wanted a more aggressive policy of defending Protestantism on the continent. over the church. Remember Puritanism? They wanted the purification of the English church and indeed English society. Parliament denounced the decadence of the court, and Parliament demanded the free market. The king was trying to inhibit enclosures and preserve the guilds and royal monopolies over manufacturing. And the members of parliament, or the majority, wanted free trade. So given these things, the parliament and the stubbornness of the king, the parliaments kept refusing to vote taxes to run the government. So Charles responds by basically trying to rule like Louis XIV or like the Spanish kings, basically in an absolutist manner. And so he arbitrarily, without consent of parliament, raises taxes for the navy. He pursues a sort of friendly policy towards the French and Spanish Catholic monarchies. He purges, with the help of Laud, the archbishop, purges the Puritans from the universities and from preaching, and does everything he can to build up the English church, the sort of kind of Anglo-Catholic church. And finally, he imposes a complete absolutism on the English colony of Ireland. And it seems to be working, but in 1638, he makes the mistake of going to war against Presbyterian Scotland. And that, of course, the defeat in that war forces him to recall Parliament, and the revolution begins. So that's basically your answer. But if you basically might also mention in the distant background the growth of Parliament as an institution, starting with Henry VIII, the rise of Puritanism based on Calvin's Geneva, and of course, way back or way underneath is the rise of capitalism, capitalist enclosures, capitalist agriculture, the rise of textile manufacturing, the general strengthening of the middle class in English society. Are there any questions about this answer?
Do the circumstances of the loss in that war matter a lot? You kind of glossed over it, it feels like.
Well, I'm just trying to be as concise as I can. And you have to answer in terms of, what's a reasonable essay, right? So obviously you have your notes and you have the recording. So you'll have to sort of if you indicate that you know something about the Scottish War, that's a good thing. It's sort of, oh well, this guy or this gal really knows some of the background. Okay.
Got it. I misunderstood. Thank you.
Yes. Any other point people wish to raise? Okay. Now, so we've done those questions. I want to now turn to the question on my list. It's question 25. The economic expansion of Europe in the 18th century was based on African slavery. Remember, I recently gave you this lecture on Africa and the slave trade, and of course the sugar plantations or the slave plantations in the New World. This is what this question is about. But also, I might note that's question 25, but question 27 is essentially the same question. So we're answering both questions here. I'm answering question 25 and question 27. So the question is, essentially what it was the effect of slavery on Europe. And so you could say that the basic answer is slavery was enormously profitable and stimulated the development of capitalism. Capitalism developed internally, of course, in Holland and England during the 16th, 17th century, but it was enormously stimulated by overseas trade, and especially the slave plantations in the New World. That's the short answer. But in what ways? Well, directly, because sugar and the other products produced by the slaves in the New World were enormously profitable, and were the second thing is that in addition to profiting from selling sugar in Europe, the burgeoning manufacturing industries in England, in Holland, and in France. Remember France in the 18th century, the sale of manufacturing, linen, cotton, textiles, and also steel and iron implements in order to work the land. All of this was also profitable. And finally, the colonies in the New World, the Canadian and American colonies on the East Coast of the American continent, they sold food and rum to the Caribbean, and with that money, they bought manufacturers from France and England. So in all these ways, this was stimulating the development of capitalism. Now, in answering, I think you should also mention the fact that while development was going on, economic development under capitalism in Europe, in Africa, what you have is the emergence of slave kingdoms, the military, and within them, the militarization and commercialization of their societies, and unending slave wars during the 17th and 18th century, all of which greatly creates chaos and huge population decline in Africa. The slaves die in these wars, Black Africans die in these wars, but they die on the way to the Americas. So that's the effect on Africa. The underdevelopment accompanies development. That's the answer to questions 25 and 27. The next question, discuss the growing economic and military supremacy discuss the growing economic and military superiority of the European powers over non-European states, evident from the 18th century. So you want to talk about military developments, then you want to talk about economic developments, which strengthen Europe. And so far as the military, you will recall that earlier I gave part of a lecture on the so-called military revolution. And by this I meant that there was a vast expansion of the military institutions of the European states as a whole, and in particular, and also particularly France, England, and Holland. And that was based on raising taxes and then developing the capitalist economy under state regulation, mercantilism. So taxation and mercantilism provide the resources for this expansion of the military. And on that basis, in the 17th and 18th centuries, you have a vast expansion of armies and navies. You can, in this connection, for example, mention that Louis XIV had an army of over 500,000 men, unprecedented, and also this enormous fleet. And of course, the English had to match that fleet. But also, there was accompanying this, there was an enormous expansion of the fortifications, building of fortifications along frontiers and so on. The improvements in cannons, in rifles, and all the weapons of war were new methods were found for producing them and making them more effective and more deadly. In the background to all this were the development of elaborate supply systems, or what we call logistics, the development of the underlying networks of production and supply to these armies and navies. So with all of this, there was a vast expansion of military potential, especially on the part of these three powers that I've mentioned. And so you see this reflected for the fact that in the Ottomans, they begin to lose their wars, and the European navies, the French and the English, become dominant in the Mediterranean from the 17th century onwards and impose their will on the Sultan. You see this in the fact that the English conquer India. They easily, small but extremely effective armies are able to overcome traditional armies. And ultimately, you might mention the Opium Wars in China as reflecting the same thing. So that's the military revolution. But then, of course, underlying that, you would say that, and we've already covered a lot of this, the development of capitalism, the development of mercantilism, the development of the middle class, the development of overseas colonialism, especially the slave plantation economy, the overall triumph of the Atlantic trade, which becomes the basis of what we call the commercial revolution of the 18th century, the intensification of trade. It all happens not in Asia, it happens in the Atlantic. And all of this is sort of preparatory. It ultimately expresses itself in the Industrial Revolution. Question? The next question deals, remember, you have this all on recording. The next question asks, the French Revolution followed from the ideas of the Enlightenment that preceded it. And here we could say that this is question 28, but question 29 is the same. It's the same question, just asked in a different way. So you just sort of adjust your answer. So I'm answering both 28 and 29 at this point. So in answering, you want to stress the importance of ideas, the importance of ideology, the importance of the Enlightenment, the importance of the scientific revolution and the political revolution in England, with particularly the ideas of John Locke, which are the rationalization of this revolution. And with respect to the scientific revolution, of course, you want to talk about the importance of what emerges in terms of intellectualizing this for contemporary thinkers in England, but especially in France, which was the center of the Enlightenment. The idea of nature being governed by reason, and that knowledge comes from facts and reason, and from that, the idea that since society and its political institutions are part of nature, they also ought to act according to the principles of reason. And therefore, the philosophers or the French intellectuals or philosophes, they demanded change to bring society and politics in relationship to um, reasons and based on empirical facts. And so, as I explained last time, they sort of questioned tradition, custom, the truths of the Catholic religion based on reason and fact. And they asserted the idea that people were either good or bad according to their experience. If society was reformed, people would be, original sin was nonsense, and people could be good if society was good. And indeed, we could even have progress in society if society was progressively changed according to the principles of reason. And more practically, they advocated these philosophers. They were not revolutionaries, except they were not revolutionaries. Most of them were not even Democrats. What they wanted was administrative and social reform. They wanted legal equality, equality of opportunity, protection of the rights of the individuals. And in economic life, they wanted a laissez-faire economy according to the principles of Adam Smith. And this all became the sort of ideology of the middle class revolution. The people as a whole rose up during the revolution, but the leaders were the middle class, and they tried to institute these principles. So that's the this sort of ideological background. But then you want to say that it's all based on the worldview of this rising middle class, which brings us to the fact that capitalism is rising in France, not to the degree, because England is a constitutional government, not to the degree of England, but nevertheless, capitalism is making progress, particularly in the overseas trade, as I mentioned. And so these are the ideas of the middle class. But the middle class is frustrated because the monarchy created by Louis XIV and continued by Louis XV and XVI is obdurate. It doesn't reform the society. And moreover, it's under the sway of the privileged nobility and upper clergy who want to preserve their fiscal and their legal privileges. Indeed, the reaction of the upper classes, keeping the middle class down, becomes absolutely central to their mentality. Meanwhile, the people situation is going from bad to worse. Now, I said that capitalism made progress overseas, but internally, the economy remained backward. Small-scale production in both whatever manufacturing there was, and also in agriculture, because the internal market, people didn't have the wherewithal to buy very much. The internal market remained impoverished, and I pointed out that there were problems with agriculture. There was not enough food being produced. There was growing unrest. The upper classes kept raising the rents on the producers in the countryside. And so ideas were fundamental to the revolution, but all of this social and economic discontent plays a very important role. So that's the answer to these two questions. Does anybody have anything that they wish to raise. Okay, I just want to deal with one last question, and that is, what were the causes of the Industrial Revolution? I have not lectured on this, but I'm going to lecture on this right now. What were the causes of the Industrial Revolution? Well, first of all, what is the Industrial Revolution? The Industrial Revolution is the entry of capital into production. The entry of capital into production, because up until the 18th century, including England, capital was essentially, there was a lot of small scale manufacturing. But for the most part, and I'm making an exception, most manufacturing was small scale. But the Industrial Revolution means machines and factories. And that means, and ultimately railways. And that means the investment of large amounts of capital in productive capacity. That's what the Industrial Revolution was all about. What I would do, the way I would approach this is to say that prior to the onset of the Industrial Revolution, which dates from about 1760 to about 1840, from 1760 to 1840 in England, there were four, we can call them revolutions that preceded the Industrial Revolution. First of all, the social and political changes in England, especially the political changes. I've already mentioned this. You understand this. We're talking about the institution of constitutional government as against absolute government. And this meant rule by the middle class, because ultimately it was the middle class that controlled the finances. We're talking about the English Parliament after 1688. The English Parliament now controlled the finances of the state. The monarchy was now under the financial control of the state. And with that, you have the creation of the Bank of England and the national debt. And finally, you have a new political ideology. And here you want to move to John Locke with his ideas of positivism, empiricism, all our information, ultimately our rational principles derived from reason, tradition, custom, innate ideas, including religious ideas, as a basis of knowledge are false. So there's all that. So there's a political and sort of ideological change that is important in creating a context, a political context for the coming of the French Revolution, of the Industrial Revolution. The second revolution is what we can call the Commercial Revolution. Now, mercantilism actually dates from the late 16th century in England and Holland, and then it's picked up by Henry IV, as I explained, state-directed economy. Well, that continues. It continues right into the beginning of the 19th century. The idea of laissez-faire, Smith's ideas, don't really triumph until 1830 in England. The English state was the state was regarded as essential to the economy up until then. The state provided protection for the national industries. The state provided colonies. The colonies that were English colonies were created by the English state, and all of these colonies, overseas markets were created by war, the English army, and especially the English Navy. So that's very important in the background, but then you might mention something about slavery and the slave plantations, the profits provided to capital for all of that. You could talk about the growth of the English Navy and merchant marine. All of that is central. And then you might end by noting that Adam Smith goes so far as to say that we don't even need the state. We should have a laissez-faire economy. So the political revolution and the commercial revolution, because there's accompanying everything I've said is a vast expansion, especially of commercial life in the Atlantic Ocean, on all shores of the Atlantic Ocean. The third revolution is the scientific and technical revolution. Of course, the big names, especially Isaac Newton, facts and reason, but also this seizes the imagination of people. And in the wake of Newton, of course, you have Locke's political philosophy, but also you have a veritable scientific and technical culture develops in England under the stimulus, of course, of capitalism, of commercial expansion, but also these ideas, at the linchpin of which is the so-called Royal Society, an actual scientific society which investigates all sorts of new technical devices and scientific principles, all directed to the improvement of the economy. Let's be clear about that. The improvement in the economy is what's in the minds of people who are patronizing these things. And of course, you also have, with all of this economic activity, with all of this improvement, you have the development amongst the lower classes, amongst the artisans, the craftsmen, of a huge level of technical competence. They don't know anything about the scientific principle. They don't know anything about the calculus, but they know how to make things. And in the 18th century, there is this incredible sort of craft culture, technical culture that develops, mechanical culture, mechanical capacity amongst the artists. And the last, and this all expresses itself eventually in the invention of the steam engine and the development of the factory system, first of all in textiles at the end of the 17th century. And last but not least, you need food in order to be underneath all of this, are not merely the artisans. There is the emergence of the English working class. The enclosure system is proceeding. The peasants are losing the land. The dispossessed peasants become workers in the coal mines and in the factories. They need to be fed. And the population expands, health conditions improve, more people survive, the population grows rapidly. And most of these people become workers. They need food, they need bread, and everything else. And what you see in the 18th century is an agricultural revolution. A lot of this new science and technique and capital is invested in improving on the enclosed land, improving agricultural output. So if you take all of these four revolutions together, the political revolution, the commercial revolution, the scientific and technical revolution, and the agricultural revolution, you have the basis for the industrial revolution, which emerges at the end of the 18th century. Anybody have any questions? Okay. I think all of this is recorded. We're going to have the test will be sent out to you, email 10:30 Tuesday morning. I want to say one thing in conclusion. I have made some political references right through this class, critical reference. And of course, I'm aware of what's going on in the Ukraine, which is not really simply about the Ukraine, tragic as that is. We're looking at a new form of world war. This is what's going on. And of course, I'm sure you're following this. And all I would say, I'm not going to get into the details, is first of all, stay away from the army. Stay away. This is my advice to you. Stay away from the military. and be very critical about what the media are saying. Be very critical because you're not being told the whole story. So with that, I bring my lectures to an end, and you'll see the exam at 10:30 on Tuesday morning. Um, I wish you the best of luck, both on the exam and also in your lives. I'm sure things will, at the end of the day, the dark clouds will disappear and the sun will come out.